First tonight, the explosive claims by the former head of the Australian Federal Police Task Force in the Australian Wheat Board scandal. The AWB crisis erupted in 2005 and led to a royal commission. The Wheat Board had paid hundreds of millions of dollars in kickbacks to Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. It was a severe embarrassment to the Wheat Board and the government of the day. But even though the Royal Commission found compelling evidence of criminal action, the police investigation into the matter wound up in 2009 without a single person being charged. Now the man who headed up that investigation, Ross Fusca, a decorated 30-year AFP veteran, says he was offered a promotion if he'd shut the inquiry down. Nick McKenzie compiled this exclusive report for 7:30 and The Age newspaper.
It was Australia's most explosive corruption saga. Hundreds of millions of dollars in kickbacks disguised as transport fees paid by wheat marketeer AWB Limited to the regime of Saddam Hussein.
Well, over the period of years that the arrangement was in place, about $224 million was paid by AWB through an intermediary to the Iraqis.
In layman's terms, that's $224 million US in kickbacks.
In kickbacks, yes.
The Royal Commission found that AWB and several individuals had acted corruptly.
I'm not making any statement.
In my belief, it was a very strong case that Commonwealth and perhaps Victorian state laws had been breached, and it demanded a thorough investigation by a police investigative agency.
A dozen AWB executives may yet face criminal charges over the $300 million paid to Iraq in kickbacks.
Decorated federal policeman Ross Fusca was appointed to help run a multi-agency task force led by the AFP to investigate the scandal.
My hopes and expectations were quite simple, as with any inquiry that I would ever been on, is to investigate it thoroughly, and if there was evidence of offences have been committed, that to lay charges.
But those hopes would be dashed. Tonight, Ross Fusca claims the AFP badly mishandled and prematurely shut down one of Australia's most important inquiries.
A number of avenues of inquiry were never pursued, and they were an integral part of the investigation. The inquiry was far from completed. Far from completed.
Fusca joined Australia's National Police Force in 1977 and cut his teeth investigating organised crime, first in surveillance and as an undercover operative, then as a senior investigator hunting drug traffickers, earning several medals, including 2 commissioners' commendations. In 2005, Fusca headed the AFP's body identification team in Thailand after the tsunami.
And this is a police service medal.
It's his life.
Yeah, I'm very privileged and honoured to have that.
I think there's certain careers that you choose and you do and you work and you get paid for it, but in some professions it's a calling, and for Ross it was a calling.
The AWB scandal promised to be the biggest case of Fusca's career. Company executives faced allegations of setting up a secret scheme to pay kickbacks to Iraq in order to secure wheat contracts in breach of UN sanctions. From 2007, as a team leader and then acting coordinator at the multi-agency task force, Fusca believed his team could build a strong case.
It became quite clear that there were indicators of criminality from my perspective.
Legal advice provided to the AFP by senior barrister Peter Hastings QC suggested that if the Federal Police could find evidence that AWB figures had lied about the kickbacks to Australian or UN officials, charges could be laid.
I agree that there is a proper basis for pursuing a case of fraud,
to the effect that officers of DFAT were deceived into granting approval to AWB for the export of wheat to Iraq.
The level of investigation, the measure of transparency displayed by the Australian government is greater than any government in the world.
The scandal was highly political from the outset, as the Howard government had faced accusations it knew of the kickbacks, a claim discounted by the Royal Commission but revived inside the AFP.
What was that intel telling the task force?
Broadly, it was saying that senior government officials were aware of what was happening, what had happened, in as much as that they were aware of the kickbacks.
Inside the AFP, Fusca says his team encountered resistance, as if someone wanted the investigation to fail.
Did the AFP throw every necessary resource behind you?
No, they didn't.
How did that make you feel?
Completely frustrated.
Fusca says that throughout 2007 and 2008, the task force was drastically undermanned, struggling to analyse millions of documents, let alone to interview suspects.
Well, the investigation didn't have any traction. I had no one to allocate work to. So we've forever trying to organise ourselves and start the investigation on some sort of direction.
Despite the hurdles, Fusca says his team was slowly building a criminal case, encouraged by lawyers from the AFP and the Director of Public Prosecutions.
The inquiry had made a significant amount of progress and identified some issues that, put into a brief of evidence, could be presented to the DPP for their consideration.
John Aegis QC believed the evidence was compelling.
Do you actually think this case will get to court one day?
Yes, I did. I thought that in my view, there were cases to answer, and I expected that the matter would be in court and that people would be prosecuted.
But in late 2008, at a police function at a bar in Canberra, Fusca had a conversation with a senior AFP officer, which convinced Fusca the AFP did not want his inquiry to continue. Fusca says the officer made him a highly irregular offer.
On this occasion, he made an unusual approach to me and pulled me away from the crowd that I was engaged in conversation with. There was just a general conversation about a variety of things, and then he said that if I could make the task force disappear, I'd be the next coordinator.
What did you take that to mean?
That if I could somehow close the inquiry, that a position of coordinator would be made available to me.
So you were effectively asked or told, if you wind down the AWB task force, you'll get a promotion?
That's correct. That's the way I interpreted it.
What was your reaction to that?
I was completely floored by it.
Why didn't you report the offer when it was made to the Corruption Internal Affairs Unit of the AFP?
I should have. If I had my time again, would have reported it there and then. But I was just so taken back by it. I suppose I was in shock.
The final straw came when Ross Fusca pushed his superiors for more investigators, believing the task force couldn't achieve its goals without at least a dozen more agents. He was offered just 3 more investigators, one who was about to resign from the AFP.
I can't do this on my own. When my management knowingly sent me an individual that was resigning from the AFP, who effectively could have given me a week or 2 weeks' work, and him thinking that all he'd be doing was photocopying, was an indictment on the whole investigation.
Fusca wrote an email to his superiors complaining about the task force's severe staffing problems and saying that if the task force continued to be treated with contempt and he like a fool, he would resign as acting coordinator. He urged his superiors to give the task force proper, effective support, given the task facing it was massive. Up until this point, Fusca's performance reviews were extremely positive, but his emails were met with a swift response.
He called me from his mobile phone to say that he'd been stood down, and you know, your initial response would be, oh, look, it's got to be a mistake, or it's obviously you've angered somebody and they've made a knee-jerk reaction.
I was stood down from my duties on the basis that I was incompetent.
Fusca took stress leave but returned to work in March 2009. He found himself sidelined and doing junior office work. In August 2009, the AFP announced it was shutting down the inquiry and handing the case to the corporate watchdog ASIC. The AFP said the decision was based on fresh advice from barrister Peter Hastings QC, who found that prosecutions were unlikely to succeed and that it was not in the public interest to continue. The AFP has declined a request from 7:30 to release his advice.
Was it an appropriate time for the AFP to begin shutting down the task force?
Oh, God, no. There was a number of avenues of inquiries that hadn't been attended to. There was thousands upon thousands of documents that hadn't been examined correctly and weren't being examined because members weren't being replaced. If the evidence wasn't there, I would say we've given it our best shot. We're not going to prove an offence. It is now time to pack this up. But we were months and months away from making that decision.
In late 2010, Fusca resigned from the AFP and began legal action. His federal court statement of claim repeats the allegations he's made tonight, including the offer of a promotion in return for making the Oil for Food task force go away. The claim also describes the pressure on Fusca to finalise his inquiry 8 months early because it was out of budget. This afternoon, AFP Commissioner Tony Negus answered questions at a Canberra press conference about Fusca's claims.
The AFP will defend those allegations that he has actually made.
It's my view that the AFP's conduct towards Ross Fusca is appalling. He's a person who's dedicated all of his working life to the interests of law enforcement and justice, and he has been humiliated, embarrassed, and at great loss to the community. He's somebody with integrity, training, knowledge and skill.
It's been 9 years since Saddam Hussein's regime fell. In that time, many executives from foreign companies have been convicted and even jailed for paying him kickbacks. But despite a royal commission finding that AWB was Saddam Hussein's biggest benefactor, not a single Australian has faced a criminal charge. ASIC's drawn-out civil penalty cases against 6 former AWB figures are mostly still stalled. Last month, the Supreme Court heard that former AWB CEO Andrew Lindbergh has agreed to admit to breaching his director's duties, although not in direct relation to paying any kickbacks. Subject to court approval, he will pay a $100,000 penalty and be banned from directing a company until 2014. Experts say the lack of success in prosecuting the perpetrators of Australia's worst corruption scandal sends the wrong message.
I think there is a grave risk of that. I think that if you don't, and if you're not seen to be taking the law seriously in this regard, you can encourage people to tough it out. But I think it's also important to spread the message that transparency and proper dealing is a very important way to conduct business. It's very important for the Australian people.
I'm going to have to take the money. Deal? Deal.
Ross Fusca is getting on with life. He even recently appeared on a game show. But it's hard for him to let go of his passion for policing and his anger about a job not properly done.
I'm lucky that he's a strong man. On the outside, you know, at times he'll be sitting there and I can see him thinking about things. It's hard.
Do you miss being a cop?
Yes. I still had a lot to offer.
That report, and we asked the AFP Commissioner Tony Negus for an interview tonight, but he declined.